Hi everyone, welcome to the second edition of Wow History Channel. My name is Ron Guth, and every week I'll be bringing you historical topics that could be controversial, politically incorrect, or things that after you hear them you'll say, wow, I was not taught that in school, wow, I never knew that before. Having said that, please understand that I'm just the messenger here. I don't take sides. I do not varnish the truth. I simply present you with information that hopefully will inspire you to research further. Part of the reason I say that is because this week's subject is slavery. In the Library of Congress, there is a collection of documents called Born in Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project, 1936 to 1938. Back in the Depression, many Americans were out of work, like they are today during the COVID pandemic. And so the government established these work projects that took these unemployed Americans and put them to work doing things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, building the Hoover Dam, and constructing all sorts of public works around the country. Those projects helped the blue-collar workers, but they also had projects that helped white-collar workers, and these would be professionals and such. One of the projects they had was an art project, and a subset of that was a writer's project, where they were trying to record American folklore so that they could write guides for each of the states. Well, in the course of doing interviews for this American Guides project, they came across some slaves and they asked them to tell their stories. Well, the stories were so compelling that they decided to make it a special project all its own, and that's where these slave narratives came from. So they sent interviewers out throughout the South and the border states, and then also in New York and Rhode Island, and they specifically sought out and interviewed people who had been slaves during the Civil War. Now keep in mind that this is 1935 to 1939, so the Emancipation Proclamation was made in 1862 and went into effect on January 1st, 1863. So anyone that was still surviving in 1936 to 1939 was going to be very old. They'd be a minimum of 74, 75 years old. So as you go through these narratives, you'll note that most of these people have ages that range from early to mid 70s to over 100 years old. The interviewers went, as I stated, all around these areas, and they collected these narratives. Now they were instructed to take the narratives down verbatim, word for word, with no editing, no influence whatsoever on what the narrative said. Whether it was controversial or not, write it down. That's the way it's going to be. There were two issues that came up with the narratives. One had to do with language, and this was because they were uncensored. They were recorded exactly as they were spoken. So the language has dialects and different words that require a sort of a slave dictionary per se, or they require you to understand what the abbreviations mean. Like there's one that's apostrophe L-E-C-T. That's apostrophe lect. What that means is recollect or remember. So you'll see a lot of these abbreviations, and it takes a little bit of time. Once you get used to them, they repeat throughout these narratives, and once you get used to them, you'll be able to read through without a problem. The other is the actual words that are used. Like, for instance, a master is often referred to as marster. Paddy roller refers to the patrols that went around and made sure that the slaves were on the plantation where they were supposed to be, or if they were not, that they had a pass that allowed them to be off the plantation. So again, once you get used to these different words and the way that they're spoken, it's very easy to read. But a lot of people have said today that this is racist, that it makes the slaves look less intelligent or whatever. But this is reality. This is the way that the words were actually spoken. The other issue that came up with these narratives was that most of the interviewers were white. The people who compiled this noted this, and they actually wrote, in fact, quote, "It is probable that in many instances caste etiquette led ex-slaves to tell white interviewers, quote, what they wanted to hear," end quote. Now, one of the reasons that the interviewers were white was because, think about this, this is the 1930s, and it was very difficult for black interviewers to come south. There were, separate but equal facilities. You had black and white drinking fountains. It was just not really easy for these black interviewers to go south and conduct the interviews. In an ideal world, it would be best to have a black interviewing another black or a former slave. But the reality is that they used a lot of white interviewers. I would like to think that the white interviewers kept an open mind, and I think as you read through the narratives, there are all sorts of narratives where they say, where the slave speaks highly of whites, speaks poorly of whites, speaks poorly of blacks, speaks highly of blacks. So there's enough in there, and there are enough interviews where you can come to a conclusion that they're fairly comprehensive and fairly accurate for the time. Now, the probably the most striking aspect of this whole thing is the number of interviews that they actually performed. Over 2,300 former slaves were interviewed for these slave narratives. So you get this really great cross-section of a slave life in America, in the South, in the Civil War and the years after. The states that were included, as I mentioned before, were all of the former slave states. So you'll see narratives from Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Kentucky, and they also did New York and Rhode Island. All of these documents have been digitized and can be read on the Library of Congress website. And I'll include the URL for the internet website in the notes below. I've read many of the interviews, especially those from Texas, because those were the first ones that I discovered as I was doing research for my master's degree in history several years ago. Here are a few things that stood out as I read the interviews. Number one, the N-word is used repeatedly throughout the narratives, mostly by the blacks referring to themselves or by other blacks. Remember, they're interviewing the slaves, not the masters and not the overseers. So this is just the way that the former slaves talked. The experiences of the former slaves varied widely depending on where they worked on the farm or plantation. If a slave was in the field, their life was very difficult, very hard, and very strict. On the other hand, if a slave worked as a domestic in a home, their life was much easier, and in many cases they became very close to the family and almost were inseparable. And these were the slaves that had the hardest time leaving the families after they were emancipated. Another thing that you'll notice as you go through these narratives is that emancipation did not necessarily mean that the slaves were set free when the proclamation was given in 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation only covered the slaves that were in states that were in rebellion. In other words, all of the Confederate states. However, if the Union Army had not yet entered or taken control of the Confederate state, they could simply ignore the Emancipation Proclamation, and in many cases they did. So you'll see throughout the narratives where masters hid from the slaves that they had been set free, and they kept it hidden for quite a while. Another thing you'll notice is that many slaves stayed on with their masters for many years after the war, or after they were set free, and a lot of times this was for economic reasons. or simply because they had nowhere else to go. I mean, just because the slaves were set free, they were not given any money. They were not given any property unless it was given to them by their masters. And so they really had no place else to go. Those who had skills, blacksmithing or weaving or anything like that, they had a better go of it. They had opportunities outside of slavery, but you'll see a lot of times where the slaves simply stayed on. To give you an example of a slave narrative, this is the story of Mary Armstrong from Texas. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read sections of her narrative and then put little notes in there to try to explain what's going on so that you can have a better understanding. Again, it has to do with the language that I talked about earlier, so we'll make a go of it. Mary Armstrong was 91. She lives in Houston, Texas. She was born on a farm near St. Louis, Missouri, a slave of a man called William Cleveland. Her father was Sam Adams, and he belonged to a slave trader who had a farm adjoining the Cleveland place. So now we have what Mary is actually saying. And I'm going to read this not as she wrote it down, not as in the uncensored version, but in a way so that you understand it better. I am Aunt Mary, all right, but you all have to excuse me because I don't talk so good, because I've been feeling poorly for a spell and I ain't so young anymore. Lordy me, when I think back what I used to do and now it's all I can do to hobble around a little. Why, Miss Olivia, my mistress, Miss Olivia was the daughter of William and Paulie Cleveland, the masters. She used to put a glass plumb full of water on my head and then have me waltz around the room, and I'd dance so smooth I didn't spill even a drop. That was in St. Louis, where I was born. You see, my mama belonged to old William Cleveland and old Paulie Cleveland, and they were the meanest two white folks that ever lived, because they were always beating on their slaves. I know because Mama told me, and I heard about it other places. And besides, old Paulie, that's the female master, she was a Paulie devil if there ever was one, and she whipped my little sister, who was only 9 months old and just a baby, to death. She come and took the diaper off my little sister and whipped till the blood just ran, just 'cause the little baby cried like all babies do, and it killed my sister. I never forgot that, but I got some even with that old Paulie devil, and it's this away. You see, I was about 10 years old, and I belonged to Miss Olivia, who was the old Paulie's daughter. And one day old Paulie devil came to where Miss Olivia lived after she married and tried to give me a lick out in the yard. And I picked up a rock about as big as half your fist and hit her right in the eye and busted the eyeball and told her that's for whipping my baby sister to death. You could hear her holler for 5 miles, but Miss Olivia, when I told her, said, well, I guess Mama has learned her lesson at last. But that old Paulie was mean like her husband, old Cleveland, till she died, and I hope they are burning in torment now. I don't remember about the start of things so much except what Miss Olivia and my mama, her name was Sibby, tells me. Of course, it's powerful cold in winter times, and the farms was lots different from down here. They called them plantations down here, but up at St. Louis they just called them farms. And that's what they was, because we raised wheat and barley and rye and oats and corn and fruit. The houses were built with brick and heavy wood, too, because it's cold up there, and we had to wear the warm clothes, and they wove on the place, and we worked at it in the evenings. Old Cleveland, this is the master, took a lot of his slaves, what was, quote, in custom, end quote, and brought them to Texas to sell. You know, he wasn't supposed to do that, because when you're in custom, that's because he borrowed money on you, and you're not supposed to leave the place till he paid up. Of course, old Cleveland just told the one that he owed the money to that the slave had run off or squirmed out some way. He was that mean. Mama said she was in one bunch and me in another. Mama had been put before this with my papa, Sam Adams, but that didn't make any difference to old Cleveland. He's so mean, he would never sell the man and woman and children to the same one. He'd sell the man here and the woman there, and if they're children, he'd sell them some other place. Oh, old Satan in torment couldn't be any meaner than what he and old Paulie was to their slaves. He would chain a slave up to whip them and rub salt and pepper on him, like he said, quote, to season him up, end quote. And when he'd sell a slave, he'd grease their mouth all up to make it look like they'd been fed good and was strong and healthy. Well, Mama say that they hadn't no more got to Shreveport before some lawman caught old Cleveland and took them all back to St. Louis because he was trying to sell them illegally. Then my little sister's born. That's the one that old Paulie devil killed, and I was about 4 years old then. Miss Olivia took a liking to me, and though her papa and mama were so mean, she was kind to everyone, and they just love her. She married Mr. Will Adams, who was a fine man. He has about 5 farms and 500 slaves, and he buys me for her, for Miss Olivia, from old Cleveland and pays him $2,500, and gives him George Henry, another slave, to boot. Lord, I was so happy to be with Miss Olivia and away from old Cleveland and old Paulie because they killed my little sister. We lived in St. Louis on Chinkapin Hill, and I was a house girl. And when the babies started to come, I nursed them and spun thread for clothes on the loom. I spun 6 cuts of thread a week, but I had plenty of time for myself, and that's when I learned to dance so good. Lord, I sure was crazy about dancing. If I was sitting eating my meal and heard a fiddle play, I would get up and start to dance. Mr. Will and Miss Olivia sure were good to me, and I never called Mr. Will master, neither, but when there was company, I called him Mr. Will, and round the house by ourselves I called them Pappy and Mammy, because they raised me up from being a little girl. I heard that old Cleveland done took my mama to Texas again, but I couldn't do anything because Miss Olivia wouldn't have much truck with her folks. She wouldn't have much to do with them. Once in a while, old Paulie comes over, but Miss Olivia tells her not to touch me or the others. Old Paulie tries to buy me back from Miss Olivia, and if they had, they'd have killed me for sure. But Miss Olivia says, I would wade in blood as deep as hell before I'd let you have Mary. And that's her talking to her mom. That's just the very words that she told him. Then I heard my papa was sold someplace, I don't know where. Of course, I didn't know him so well, just what Mama done told me. So that didn't worry me like Mama being taken so far away. One day, Mr. Will said, Mary, you want to go down to the river and see the boat race? Lord me, I will never forget that. Where we live, it isn't far to the Mississippi River, and pretty soon here they come, the Natchez and the Eclipse. These are both paddle wheel steamers, with smoke and fire just pouring out of their smokestacks. That old captain on the Eclipse started putting in bacon meat in the boiler, and the grease just come out a blazing, and it beat the Natchez to pieces. I stayed with Miss Olivia till 1863, when Mr. Will set us all free. I was about 17 years old then, or more. I say I'm going to go find my mama. Mr. Will fixes me up 2 papers, one about a yard long and the other smaller, but both has big gold seals that he says is the seal of the state of Missouri. And what these were just documents that proved that she was a freed slave. He gave me money and bought my fare ticket to Texas and told me that those are still slave times down here in Texas, and to put the papers in my bosom, but to do whatever the white folks tell me, even if they want to sell me. But he says, before you get off the auction block, just pull out the papers and hold them up, but just hold them up so they can see them. Don't let them have them. and don't let them out of your hands, and when they see them, they have to let you alone. Miss Olivia cried and carried on and said to be careful of myself because it was sure rough in Texas. She gave me a big basket that had so much to eat in it I couldn't hardly heft it, and another with clothes in it. They put me in the back end of a boat where the big old wheel was that ran the boat, and I go to New Orleans. The captain puts me on another, and I come to Galveston. And that captain puts me on another boat, and I come up this here Buffalo Bayou to Houston. I looked around Houston, but not long. It was a dumpy little place then, and I got the stagecoach to Austin. It took us 2 days to get there, and I thought my back was busted sure enough. It was such a rough ride. Then I had trouble for sure. A man asks me where I was going and says to come along, and he takes me to a Mr. Charlie Crosby. They take me to the auction block where they sell slaves. I got right up like they told me because I remembered what Mr. Will told me to do, and they started bidding on me. And when they got cried off, when the auction was over and I was sold, they put Mr. Crosby came up to get me, and I just pulled out my papers and held them up high, and when he saw them, he said, "Let me see them." But I said, "You just look at it up here," and he squints up and says, "This gal is free and has papers," and tells me he is a legislature man and takes me and lets me stay with his slaves. He is a good man. He tells me there's a slave camp in Wharton County, but I didn't have any money left. But he paid me for some working, and when the war's over, I started to hunt Mama again. And I found her in Wharton County, near where Wharton is. Lord me, you talk about crying and singing and crying some more. We sure done it. I stayed with Mama till I got married in 1871 to John Armstrong, and then we all came to Houston. I got me a job nursing for Dr. Relaford and was all through the yellow fever epidemic. I remembered in 1875 people died just like sheep with the rots. I've seen folks with the fever jump from their bed with death on them and grab other folks. The doctor saved lots of folks, white and black, because he sweated out of them. He mixed up hot water and vinegar and mustard and something else in it. But Lordy me, so much has gone out of my mind because I am 91 years old now, and my mind, just like my legs, just kind of hobble around a little bit. That's the story of Mary Armstrong, and this is just one example of the many narratives that you'll read as you go through this slave narrative series. I highly recommend it so that you get a better understanding of what slave life was like, not from historians today, but from the people that actually lived it. After you read even a few of these narratives, you will say, wow, I never knew that, and I was never taught that in school. Thank you. If you like this program, please hit subscribe and like, and I'll see you next week for another. Thank you.